Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second video of the addiction module. Today, we're going to be looking at risk factors in addiction. Um, Probably an important point to note straight off the bat with this bullet point is that what I'm going to go through is actually nowhere near enough. In some ways, this is actually five mini bullet points squeezed into one. So it's a hell of a lot of detail. Now, the reason why not everything is in the slides is because I usually get my students to do their own and design their own and then present their own presentations on this, and they each have a risk factor. So there's not as much detail here, but what I'm going to go through is the basics, and you obviously do need the basics to start off with. So risk factors in addiction. There are five of them. But before we go into this, we need to actually talk about what a risk factor is. Because this is actually the first time during the whole of your 2 years at college doing psychology that we ever talk about risk factors. Yet if you're going to go off to do psychology at uni, risk factors are all you ever talk about. So, what is a risk factor? I've got a good definition here. It's a risk factor or determinant, which is a variable associated with an increased risk of disease or infection. Generally speaking, the more risk factors you have for a behavior, the more likely you are to engage in that behavior. So, for example, having a gene for, let's say, OCD, having a OCD gene, if you will, is a risk factor of getting OCD. Now, having that risk factor makes you more at risk than not having the gene. But then if you add, I don't know, a traumatic childhood and maybe bullying and poor parenting styles, these are risk factors that then elevate your chances. So we're looking at essentially things that cause addiction. And there are five risk factors that we are looking at. So I've got an example here. Risk factors for diabetes are family history, age, ethnicity. You can change some risk factors. So you can control some risk factors, like lifestyle choices, but there are other risk factors that you just can't. So, for example, I know, as I've said to my class many times, I know that I have the risk factor of getting diabetes because it runs in my family. Now, probably would have got it by now, realistically, because it's type 1, which you tend to get quite early. That's a risk factor that I can't do anything about, but I could not eat chocolate, for example, which is a risk I'm not willing to take. So, risk factors for addiction. There are five of them. Right, the first one is stress, and they don't go in this order for some reason. You've got personality, family influences, peer influences, and then genetics as well. Now, you could get a question. So, if I just show you the spec just here, this second one right here, you could get a question on this. And it could be about any of the five or all of the five. So if I just show you the questions that have come up so far, have a look at this. There's only ever been 3 questions in about 7 years. So this question doesn't come up too much, but I do think it is going to come up with a bit more regularity going forward because, like I say, this is such an important bullet point. So if you have a look here, there's an 8 marker, outline and evaluate personality, one of the risk factors, and that's an 8 marker. They're going to go down that route, or they're going to hit you with this question just here, discuss risk factors. And then you can pick your 2 or 3 that you feel most comfortable with. Please note, if you get this question, discuss risk factors, don't talk about all 5. Because if you talk about all 5, you've got great breadth, but you've got rubbish depth. So you're given maybe 1 sentence on each, and that's a bit crap, to be honest. So you probably want to avoid that. But anyway, let's look at these 5. So I'm going to start off, I think, with genetics. And genetics is, to be honest, genetics is a risk factor for most. And like I say, a reminder, there's a lot more to this. There is a lot more to this than this presentation suggests. There's a lot more AO1 you need to know. I'm just giving you the basics here. But it's worth noting that a specific addiction cannot be inherited. So if we look at internet addiction, you clearly have no genes for internet addiction because our genes do not develop that quickly. The internet was only created in about 1990. Genes don't develop that quickly. So whilst you don't have a specific gene for alcohol addiction or a specific gene for a marijuana addiction or internet addiction, you do have specific genes that make you vulnerable to kind of chemical states, if you will. So what is inherited is a vulnerability to drug dependence. So let me give an example. If for a laugh, I gave all of my students 5 cigarettes to smoke, like not vapes, cigarettes. And I tell you all, you've got to smoke all 5 within a 20-minute period, right? Let's imagine no one has smoked before. No, let's imagine that. Clean start. If I give you all the same cigarettes in the same environment with the same instructions, are you all going to like cigarettes the same amount? No. Some of you would actually really like the taste of it. Some of you will really like the smell of it or the feel of it. Most of you won't, in my opinion, correctly so. Most of you won't. But that's got to be something genetic. You've got a vulnerability to the sensations of the drugs. So, for example, I'm going to use the fact that you're an ex-smoker. Cool. Candy is an ex-smoker. I never really have smoked seriously. I did it for about 2 weeks, like when I was about 21, and it was rubbish, and I hated it. If we were to both smoke, what we would feel would be very, very different. Candy would absolutely love it and would get, I don't know, lovely sensations from it. It'd make it feel fantastic. I would feel like I was sucking on a car exhaust and not like that. That has no appeal to me whatsoever. So there's got to be something genetic about it. Now, there is some evidence that suggests that there is something genetic. Shields looked at 40. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, to be honest, but this is a good example about smoking. You've got Shah et al. Said that actually there's strong evidence in men for genetic transmission, and Black in 2006 also found that first-degree relatives of gambling addicts were much more likely to suffer the same fate as more distant relatives. Now, here's a key point I need you to write down. That second point, I'm going to read that again. Black et al. Also found that first-degree relatives, brothers, sisters, parents, children, first-degree relatives of gambling addicts are much more likely to suffer the same fate as more distant relatives. Now, on one hand, that's a good piece of research. It demonstrates evidence for genetics. On the other hand, you cannot separate out genetics from the environment. Maybe their genetics, maybe they're addicted because they've learned it from their parents, for example, or they've learned it from their brother or sister. So it's impossible to be able to separate, or very, 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 very difficult to separate out genetics from the environment. It's almost impossible. Now, in terms of valuations, now, by the way, just so you're aware, I've not given evidence for all of these 5 risk factors. I've not given evaluations for all of these 5 risk factors. It's on my list of stuff to do, but I'm not going to do it now. It's biologically reductionist, therefore it's quite parochial, you'd want to say, in its viewpoint. It's saying that this complex behavior of addiction is just down to the fact you've got this one gene. That's a bit BSy, to be honest. That's a bit crap. It is biologically deterministic, so it says it's completely out of your control. It's completely out of your control, and because of this, that makes it quite an insensitive theory. And the other thing that's pretty key here is no genetic explanation has ever found a 100% concordance rate, i.e., if an identical twin had an alcohol addiction, their other twin has a 100% chance of developing that disorder. Unless, and what I'm about to say is quite important here, unless we're never going to, well, we've never found that. We've never found a 100% concordance rate, which means at best, the genetic explanation for addiction is only a partial explanation and not the full explanation. Therefore, it's got lowered explanatory power. Now, that's probably the most detailed risk factor, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, in terms of this slide. The next one, and then there's these two as well, which I forgot. The next one is stress. How can stress, everyday stress, cause addictions? If you're in my group and you are looking at this for ideas to present to the class, I suggest you find a test that measures somebody's stress. Now, let me ask you, just rhetorically, student watching this, how stressed are you right now in your everyday life? Your answer will probably be like, oh my God, I'm so stressed. Right? But in reality, adolescence is a difficult time. I'm not really that stressed. Anyway, what am I talking about here? Stress appears to be a consistent and constant trigger for addiction, as a way of dealing with the addiction. So stress, addictions come about as a way of dealing with the stress of everyday life or traumatic events. So chronic and unmanaged stress is often correlated with the onset of addiction. Write that down, but also note that it's only a correlation. One does not, if it's a correlation, it means there's a relationship between stress and addiction, which is unsurprising. But does that mean that stress causes addiction? Surely being addicted causes you to be stressed. Surely if you're having to break into people's cars to steal stuff for your heroin fix, surely that's going to be quite stressful to some people. Surely that's going to cause a lot of stress. And it suggested that stressful events are certain points at certain points of development can have damage and effects upon the brain. If you have trauma as a kid, so if you're abused, sexually, physically, mentally, if you're neglected as a kid, bad parents who leave you outside and don't feed you and stuff, surely that stress is going to cause the wiring in your brain to be a little bit different and cause you to be maybe more vulnerable to addictions down the line. And Drissen et al. And others found that traumatic events expose individuals to addictions. 30% of drug addicts and 15% of alcoholics had some form of early trauma in their lives. Write that down, but also again add to it that again, those aren't 100% percentages. So therefore, what about the 70% of drug addicts who didn't have a traumatic childhood? What about the 85% of alcoholics who didn't have trauma in their life before their addiction? This is only a partial explanation. However, one thing that fascinates me and I've done quite a lot of research on, like through uni and postgraduate degrees and stuff, is resilience, also sometimes known as hardiness. Hardiness is the ability to endure difficult conditions. Resilience is the ability to bend and adapt to stressful situations. So very, very slightly different. Some people are more hardy than others. Some of you, let's look at the class that you're in. All of you are going through, academically at least, the same thing. Okay, you're taking different courses, but you've all got exams. You're all trying to identify where you fit in the world. You're all, having to deal with pressures of, your image and popularity. And But some of you are so much hardier than others. You can deal with that stress really well. You can just endure it. You can rationalize it. You can deal with it incredibly well. Some of you are shocking at dealing with stress. Truly shocking. Like you blow over in the softest breeze, right? And I'm so stressed. And some of you are really loud about it and sometimes quite annoying about it. But this is whether you're hardy or not, is a nice little extra bit of AO1 because Kobasa found there are 3 C's that really help you deal with stress if you're a hardy individual. And the first one is your commitment, your strong sense of purpose. If you're committed to whatever goal you're working on, so some of you, for example, are very committed to your education. That's hardiness, basically. Control. When we've looked at this before, some of you have got an internal locus of control, and those of you who have an internal locus of control are going to feel less stressed, or rather, you're going to deal with your stress quite well because you think, I've got this. All I have to do is get my head down and work, and I'm motivated to be able to do that. Some of you have an external locus of control, and you think your teacher in biology is the reason why you're failing. There's nothing I can do about it, right? And therefore you're getting stressed whilst giving yourself no ability to deal with that stress. And then the last one is challenge. One thing I will tell you as we get towards the exams is I really, really don't think you should fear the exams. The exam should fear you. It shouldn't be the other way around. The exam should be something that you run towards rather than run away from. For example, you need to see it as a challenge to you, not a threat to you. And too many students see it as a threat. So if, for example, you see life in a positive way and you see, for example, let's say your boss is making you work really hard, like working you deadlines, throwing work at you. If you're there like, no, keep it coming, I've got this, and you're thriving under that stressful pressure, you'll be fine. You're a hardy individual. I like working under pressure. I find that's when I do my best work. I get stressed about it, of course, but I see it as a challenge rather than something to be threatened by. Again, some of you see it as challenge, some of you see it as threat. So there's quite a lot of AO1 here for stress. Does it fully explain addictions? No, because there's a lot of people who don't really have stressful lives yet they have addictions. So it's only probably a weak correlation. Hardiness brings face validity to the explanation. And by the way, hardiness explains individual differences. It explains why students can go through the same experience, yet some of them develop addictions. I've had alcoholic students before. I've 100% I've had alcoholic students. I know who they are. Students who cannot deal with this everyday life of stress, everyday stress of life. They don't deal with it very well. They fail to function adequately. One of them, I remember a couple of years ago, one of them was boasting. She was a lovely student, but one of them was boasting about how many empty bottles of alcohol they had in their room. And that was during by the way, that was during lockdown. That was during lockdown, and she was not dealing with the stress of the pandemic well at all, and she turned to drinking. So, whereas some people actually did quite well in lockdown. The other thing about this, stress is an entirely manageable condition. Entirely manageable. This theory tells us how we can deal with stress. How do we make students more hardy? How do we make them more resilient? How can we create a therapy? So this theory creates a therapy. This theory creates therapy. Personality. First things first, there's no such thing as an addictive personality. There's been a lot of research into this, and they've just never found the 16 personalities, Myers-Briggs. If you don't know it, type 16 personalities into Google and take the test. But there is no such thing as an addictive personality. However, there may be certain traits that put you more at risk of developing, and that's what you need. You need to know the personality traits. Um, anti Kind of going off that, antisocial personality disorder is, I guess, it's a type of personality in a way, but really it's a personality disorder, unsurprisingly. That has been linked to addictions, particularly the impulsivity of it. I've just realised. Oh, there we go. So link ASPD to impulsivity. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder, have a high degree of risk taking. They prefer immediate gratification. So, like, I want it now, I want it now. And they don't think about long term goals. Think about drug addicts, for example. Drug addicts they don't want to think, oh, I need to go to uni, I need to get a degree, I need to really improve my prospects in life. They go, I need that hit now, and I need that hit now, and I'll sell my grandma for it. And then finally, they generally lead chaotic lives where they don't necessarily know where the next meal is coming from. They don't necessarily have stable relationships or stable abodes, places to live. So this is your AO1, really. There is more to this, to be perfectly honest. There is a lot more to this. You can take one of the 16 personalities, but as I say, strictly speaking, there isn't one personality of these 16 that makes you more at risk. I just think this is quite a good test to take. You've also got Eysink's 3 super traits that are linked, and this is also AO1. So what I've gone through so far about ASPD, that's a different theory. Now we're moving on to Eysink's theory, which is his 3 traits. And the first one is extroversion. The more extroverted you are, the more under-aroused your brain is. So I don't know how much you know this, but generally speaking, if you consider yourself to be an extrovert, which most teenagers like considering themselves as extroverts, actually, like, oh, we like to be the centre of the pie, yeah. If you're an extrovert, your brain is actually quite understimulated. It's quite a quiet brain. So that's why you go to parties, to try stimulate your brain. And that's why you may take drugs to stimulate your brain, because your brain is naturally quite quiet, quite not, you don't really have that much electricity going around. I'm not saying you're thick, but your brain is quite a quiet brain. Whereas if you're introverted, you like to keep yourself to yourself. You find social situations quite tiring, maybe. Your brain's quite over aroused, if you will, quite hyper stimulated. So you don't need that social. So one key super trait about addiction is actually how extroverted you are. The more extroverted you are, according to Eysenck, the more likely you are to be addicted. Neuroticism. The opposite of being neurotic is being calm and stable. Some of my students, I can name them right now, some of my students are quite neurotic. They're not particularly calm or stable. They're often hyperactive. They suffer immense anxiety. They tend to be quite frantic. So neurotics have low emotional stability and a low tolerance for stress, combining with the other risk factor. And so they turn to addictive substances to self-medicate. Really important term, that. It's a really important term. So extroverts try to stimulate. Neurotics try to self-medicate. And then finally, psychoticism. Psychoticism is the less important trait. It was added later on. But individuals with this trait are generally antisocial and impulsive, which leading them to addictive substances more often than, I'll try heroin. Why not? Why not? Why not? Right. So psychotics, or people with high psychoticism, generally tend to be quite impulsive. So link extroversion to under-arousal, neuroticism to self-medication, and psychoticism to impulsivity. You need to link those 3 to those 3. A couple of pieces of research just here, which I'm not going to go into, but Cal and Sue. You've also got another piece of research just there as well by Verhoel, which is quite. I like Verhoel. There's a few good stats in there actually, but 44% of alcoholics have personality disorders. 70% of cocaine addicts have personality disorders. 79% of heroin addicts or opiate addicts could be prescription drugs also have personality disorders. So this is quite a big personality is quite a big one, but there's no such thing as a personality disorder. Couple of evaluations. There are a lot more. I'm going to move on to the number 4 and number 5, family influences. How many, just, and maybe your parents are in this room and maybe it's going to make it a bit awkward now, but how many of you think that your parents have addictions? The truth is, most of your parents do have addictions. It could be phone, it could be, I don't know, it could be alcohol, it could be some things you don't know about, right? But most of your families who have addictions, to what extent is that passed down? Now, to be honest, there's quite a lot to this. These next two are particularly short, by the way. These next two ones are particularly short. There's a lot more to it. So given that your family are pretty integral in your behavior, perceived parental approval is absolutely critical. Perceived parental approval. So it's not your mum going, yeah, you can smoke, or your dad going, yeah, take heroin, come and join me, take it, right? It's perceived parental approval. So they might know that you're addicted to something or know that you're doing a behavior, but they don't confront you about it. And so you think, oh, if they're not telling me about it, that's fine. And that they approve of it. So therefore I'm going to continue. So perceived, if your parents approve your addiction, you will almost certainly continue. And Livingston found that when high school students were allowed to drink at home by parents, the kids often became addicted in their first year. So it's perceived, and this is what the point I make here. It's a perception of approval. It's not actual approval. I don't think there's many parents out there that would actively approve a child getting addicted to a substance, but it's the perception of approval that's actually quite important. Adolescents were found to believe that if their behavior is not monitored, this constitutes a parental approval and drug taking behavior. The practical applications of this are off the scale. We need to teach parents how to deal with their children becoming addicted to behaviors and saying, that's not okay, you've crossed a line, that's beyond your limit. You need to stop doing this now. So family influences are quite important here. And you could talk about social learning theory here. Social learning theory, so easy. If you see your role model get addicted to something, you're going to copy their behavior. So social influence is another thing that's not in here. The other thing is exposure. If the addiction is an everyday feature of the family, it will likely be continued by the offspring. But that's not necessarily true, is it, for everyone? Some of your parents smoke or vape, yet you don't. Some of your parents drink heavily, yet you don't. Some of your parents are, well, I was going to say addicted to their phone, but all of you are addicted to your phone, so that one doesn't work. But some of your parents may have drug addictions, yet you maybe possibly don't. So exposure, this is a good explanation, but my second mum was a smoker, yet I've never really smoked before, so it doesn't really apply to everyone. And the last one, and arguably the most important one, to be perfectly honest with you, is peer influences. So your friends, which is a huge factor here. So peer influences are, let's face it, they are much more powerful than the family influences, especially at the age of 18. O'Connell suggested 3 major features of drinking and peer pressure, and this is just one small. Remember, this is one small aspect of peer influences. Again, by the way, you can use either social identity theory here or social learning theory. I suggest you look at both of them and apply it to peer influences. So O'Connell suggested three major features of drinking and peer pressure. And at-risk adolescent attitudes and norms about drinking are associated with, so attitudes and norms. So what is the norm in the group? What is the norm about drinking in the group? Experienced peers provide more opportunity for the at-risk person to drink alcohol. So they're going to take them to bars, for example. So they're going to show them how to drink, what to drink, so on and so forth. And the other bit is the catch-up issue. The at-risk individual often overestimates how much their experienced peers are drinking and tries to catch up as a result. So if you're with your mates, for example, pre-drinking around someone's house, and you're drinking, you might see more bottles, not than there actually are, but you might think your friends are drinking quicker than you, and you will try drink more to catch up, get drunk, and may get addicted that way. I think that's a pretty crap theory, really. I think what's much more important is social identity theory here. What I would advise, as I've said, is you look up social identity theory if you don't already know it. It might actually be worth looking at these slides to double check I haven't put it on there, because after this screencast, which is going to finish in the next minute or so, I'm going to probably put this on these slides. But social identity theory should be in here as well, really. So those are the five. I cannot stress to you enough that actually what I've gone through is relatively basic. There's a lot more to these theories and you need to know it. So have a look through these slides to make sure I haven't updated it, but definitely look in the online textbook as well and any other resources that I may have. But as always, that is it. I've been going quite a while. How long has this video been going on for? I've been wanging on for ages. That is everything. Hope, as always, this is useful. Peace out.